by Jason Reza Jorjani is out right now. The Fundamental Thinkers. It covers Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger. Dr. Reza Jorjani, one of my audience's favorite guests. Welcome back. How are you doing?
It's great to see you, Neil. Hope we can make an occasion to see each other again in person. Maybe I'll make it back over to New York. But in any case, it's been too long, and it's good to be back with you.
Yeah, great to be back. And you and I had a quick, brief little discussion. I was able to read a good chunk of your book before we started, not the whole thing. Obviously, I went straight to the Plato section, and the Hegel section was another one I flipped towards, and then Nietzsche. Those three. And obviously I read your introduction too. The introduction was phenomenal, and you kind of go through philosophy. What it even is philosophy? Is it philosophy as we see today, where you have a philosophy major who gets a Ph.D. and then teaches what the history of philosophy, or is it something else? And what you mentioned, something that was actually it was a powerful line in your book right in the beginning, where you said the philosophy departments today are a mausoleum of the dead, of what is of something that is dead now. What do you? Let's start there, and we'll get into Plato later on.
So look, philosophy, as you know well, being a classicist, philosophy begins by framing itself against two different modalities of, let's say, discourse. One is relatively uneducated, unreflective, blind belief and baseless opinion. In other words, the everyman's unreflective beliefs and attitudes about everything that he takes himself to be qualified in passing judgment on. And for the most part in the Platonic dialogues, we see Socrates attack these kinds of people. Now, they may be very wealthy people. It doesn't mean necessarily by every man that we're talking about impoverished members of society here, right? So one of the things that pissed off the Athenians to the point where Socrates wound up being prosecuted by the Democratic Assembly of that city is that he humiliated too many wealthy but ignorant people who were basically not just volunteering baseless opinions, but making very important decisions on the basis of unexamined beliefs and assumptions. So that's one modality of human discourse that philosophy is framing itself against. And of course, that's very old. I mean, that's like, the default modality of most of human history before the rise of philosophy in classical Greece. Then the other modality of human discourse that was relatively more recent, which philosophy is also framing itself against, is sophistry. In other words, you had these people beginning, let's say, in the archaic period, who were book smart. They had read a lot, and they were clever in being able to craft arguments like a lawyer so that they could argue your case for you either orally or in writing, no matter what your position was. And they didn't give a shit whether you were in the right about whatever it was you were arguing, only whether you were paying them enough to craft a clever argument, either to win them a case in court or to get a bill passed in the assembly, so that, let's say, if you're Pericles, you hire one of these sophists to write an oration for you, right? And to try to move the assembly through the cleverness of your discourse. So these sophists were out there doing this also. And one of the most famous of them was a guy called Isocrates. Not to be confused with Socrates. There was a guy called Isocrates who was an infamous sophist in that period. And so Plato, through the character of Socrates, through this dramatic persona that Plato, the aspiring playwright turned philosopher, uses as a mouthpiece throughout his philosophical project, Plato is taking aim both at the, baseless opinions of relatively uneducated, unreflective people on the one hand, and then the nihilistic sort of amoral sophistry of these, clever argumentative people for hire on the other hand. And so that starts to indicate, what philosophy is, namely an authentic concern with understanding truth, beauty, and justice as different avenues of approach toward what you could call the good. But the good has to be understood in a way that's not filtered through 2,000 years of Christian moral discourse, namely not as, the virtuous or, the morally right, but the good as what all other things are good for. In other words, that for the sake of which, the telos, right, of all things. Like one mistake that's commonly made, and we'll get into this later, we can stay with Plato for a bit, but when we get to Aristotle, one mistake that's commonly made is that people think that Aristotle's prime mover is like the good in the sense of the Christian summum bonum, and it's identifiable with somehow the Christian God. But Aristotle's prime mover is really the good in exactly the same sense as Plato talks about the good, namely that for the sake of which, I believe the Greek is something like totu heneka, that what all other things are for, and the end that determines all ends.
And that's that's Aristotle's telos.
Exactly.
Endgame, yeah. Not on and what you're saying is that Thomas Aquinas totally bastardized this idea in the Western mind, and now we have this all jumbled up. We don't have it right anymore.
100%. So, anyway, I don't want to get too far down into that ontological rabbit hole right now, but in short, Aristotle's first cause is not an originary causal mechanism that like sets the world into motion or creates the cosmos. It's the final goal or purpose for which all other purposes are provisional and towards which they are moving.
Wow. Would you know how you get these Enlightenment deist thinkers? Are they sort of going towards that idea, or is it something different?
The problem with the Enlightenment deists is that as much as they wanted to free themselves from Christian scholasticism, they're still subconsciously conditioned by it. And
Sure.
They wound up thinking of the creative agency of God in terms of the high precision manufacturing that Swiss clockmakers were, inventing at that time. So that, as soon as you started to get finely tailored, identical replacement parts of complex mechanisms, the thinkers of the age began to conceive of the cosmos having been put together the same way, namely by some supreme craftsman. And that is not Aristotle's conception of the cosmos. I mean, in fact, that's not a conception of the cosmos that any of the classical Greeks had. In my book, when you go, through Heraclitus, Plato, and Aristotle, you see that from Heraclitus onward, there is the understanding that the cosmos as a whole is uncreated. And this, for some reason, is difficult for contemporary people to grasp. I mean, you know this. You argue with these people all the time. It's like beating a fucking dead horse.
Yeah.
They can't wrap their mind around the fact that it's a human fallacy to believe that because we make things, by the way, we always make things from out of other things that already exist.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, whether you're a farmer who's getting an egg from a chicken, right? Or whether you're a craftsman who's, tailoring pieces of a hammer in a workshop, you're always working with pre-existing material, right? And these guys can't wrap their minds around the fact that the universe as a whole, or the multiverse, or what the Greeks simply called the cosmos, doesn't need to have been created by anyone. Things come to be and pass away within this cosmos. Solar systems may come into being and then may disintegrate, right? Whole galaxies may emerge and then eventually they may decohere, right? But the cosmos as a whole, like Now, let's say you subscribe to the multiverse idea. A whole universe could come into being. It could bang, right, out of a quantum instability,
Out of chaos.
out of chaos. And that universe could collapse, right? But it doesn't mean that there aren't other universes or in other dimensions that continue to persist in a state of flux. So this notion that the cosmos as a whole, or everything that we could aspire to wrap our minds around, had to have been created by someone at some point is a complete logical fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. So, and it is not a mistake that the classical or archaic Greeks made. Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle all understand that the cosmos as a whole is uncreated. Philosophy's task is to understand the causal nature of the processes through which things come to be and pass away, and the nature of knowledge about those things. In other words, ontology and epistemology, how we can come to know those things? And then what are the ethical implications of that ontology and epistemology? Once you have some understanding of the nature of things, and once you have a model of the right way to acquire knowledge, or the proper methodology of knowing something, rather than simply operating on baseless beliefs or opinions, then there are ethical implications that follow from that ontology and epistemology. And one of the most interesting things that you see in both Plato and Aristotle that I point out in Fundamental Thinkers is the extent to which aesthetics shapes the ethics of these thinkers. Like, all the fundamental ethical terms in Aristotle, and this is again another way in which the Christians have completely perverted Aristotle, all the fundamental ethical terms in Aristotle are aesthetic. The man is talking about the good as kalon, as the beautiful, and a virtuous life, in other words, a life of arete, as a life of excellence. And repeatedly, when he talks about the good, he talks about the most beautiful action and so on and so forth, right? Exercising the mean virtues, like, for example, courage, which is a mean between recklessness and cowardice, foolhardy recklessness and cowardice. Exercising the mean virtue of courage is to act beautifully, as Aristotle puts it. His ethical descriptors are often aesthetic. And you see this going all the way back to Plato, that aesthetics and ethics are really almost inextricable. And then finally, what follows from a proper ontology and epistemology and an understanding of the ethical implications of that is a conception of how to structure social life so that it is just. In other words, a political philosophy. And unless you have a political philosophy, you're not a philosopher. Because, and I've explained this at length, including in this book, in the intro that you were referencing earlier, because you're liable to have political assumptions and implicit ideological commitments that will warp the rest of your thinking. It'll limit what you allow yourself to think about in the domains of ontology, including, let's say, what human nature is, or it will make you filter certain things out of the net of your comprehension of things, so that your epistemic framework will be unconsciously censored by implicit political commitments that you have. Because, you'll be subconsciously thinking that, oh, if I even entertain such a thing as a form of knowledge about, let's say, human biology, then I'm violating whatever implicit commitment I have to a certain political ideology. Like, for example, to make it concrete, if you implicitly believe that all humans are equal, right? That, like, all people are born with equal potential and equal capacities, and therefore they should all be treated equally. Well, you're not going to engage with massive biological and psychological data that demonstrates significant human population group differences in capacities, right? And so your epistemology is going to be warped by implicit political commitments. So a philosopher has to be able to think in all these dimensions and across these dimensions, and to develop original concepts that address everything from ontology and epistemology to ethics, aesthetics, and politics. And my reason for saying that and taking that as exemplary for the philosopher is that is precisely how philosophy comes into the world. I mean, we know what philosophy is based on who the fundamental philosophers were, right? I mean, Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle represented a new human type. There was nothing like that in recorded history before them. And so they are exemplary for a modality of fundamental thinking. That's why I called the book that. A modality of fundamental thinking that has persisted now for 2,500 years, and where we can identify certain key figures that form the backbone of that trajectory to the present time.
And now these thinkers all have their elements that you basically point out, like episteme, ethics. There's a few other ones you throw in there.
Ontology, aesthetics, and political philosophy.
Political. So these fundamental thinkers all have this holistic approach. Without one of those things, the whole thing collapses. What you're saying?
It's vulnerable to collapse, and more importantly, the lack of any one of those things, like, let's say, I mean, clearly, if you're not thinking metaphysically, if you're not asking questions about the nature of the cosmos or what human nature is and so forth, or whether there is a human nature, well, then clearly you're not a philosopher, right? Like, for example, I mean, Leo Strauss, he said it himself. He said, I'm a political thinker. Don't call me a philosopher. People call him a political philosopher. Well, there's no fucking thing as a political philosopher. If you are engaged in serious political thought, you may be analyzing ideologies very adeptly. You may have analyses that are really insightful, incisive, and prescient regarding geopolitical affairs or domestic policies and so forth. But okay, you're a political thinker. You're not a philosopher, unless you're asking about the nature of reality, or let's say, posing humanity as a question. What's human nature? So that's very clear. But on the other hand, also, like, if you're thinking metaphysically and maybe you even have an ethics like William James did, but you have no serious political thought whatsoever, not only are you vulnerable to the collapse of other aspects of the system that you've built up, because you have this Achilles heel in an undeveloped political thought, you're actually an undeveloped person as a thinker. And the qualities of your character do not fit the type of the philosopher as it was defined by Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Plato, Aristotle, right? So, like, a philosopher, part of what I'm arguing, and I have been in a number of my books now, including this one, Fundamental Thinkers, is that a philosopher is a type, right? Like an artist is a type. I mean, you can identify an artist as a human type. I mean, an engineer is a human type, right? And so is a philosopher. And essential to that type is this integral thinking, right, across all of these different dimensions. Because these dimensions exhaustively describe the scope of fundamental thinking. Like, you cannot identify for me another domain or aspect of thinking which would be fundamental besides ontology, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, and politics, or what Plato would have called truth, beauty, and justice. That's comprehensive. And everything else follows from that. Like, for example, if you're a scientist, physics, biology, chemistry, etc., that follows from ontology and epistemology. Those are outgrowths from that. Or like even astrophysics, for example. Those are then further branchings from out of ontology and epistemology. And historically, we saw that all of the empirical sciences devolved from out of philosophy, right? We only get people who start calling themselves empirical scientists in a limited sense, saying, oh, I'm a physicist, I'm a biologist, whatever. We only get that in the 1800s. Before that, they all called themselves natural philosophers. So that's what I would say about, the integral character of philosophical thought.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to talk about knowledge. Obviously, Gnosis is a big topic on this channel. And you talk about episteme and noesis in your book. real quick, I just want to show something from Plato, if you don't mind. Socrates and Glaucon are talking, and this is like this to me stands out as one of the esoteric doctrines of Plato that people don't make. No, I don't know what to make of this, but he says that you should also say that not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good, and he uses the word in Greek. I checked it; it's episteme, not gnosis here. The objects of episteme owe their being known to the good, to the kalon, but their being is also due to it, although the good is not being, but superior to it in rank and power.
Okay, hold on. That requires unpacking right there.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Very complicated area. It's a little bit subtle. Okay, so not only do the objects of episteme owe their being known to the good. In other words, if there weren't that for the sake of which, okay, if there weren't that for the sake of which, you couldn't know anything. Meaning that the modern and postmodern idea that, or let's say notion, the modern, let's say relatively recent notion that, there's nothing that is necessarily affording us knowledge, and anything that we happen to learn about something is arbitrary and haphazard. In other words, we happen upon facts that we organize as data, and there's nothing that's making that knowledge possible. Plato rejects that off the bat, and he says there's a condition for the possibility of knowledge. And unless that precondition existed ontologically, let's say, unless that precondition were in place ontologically, you couldn't know anything about anything in the first place. So that's the first part of the statement. And then he says, but their being is also due to it. In other words, no thing would exist but for what it is that makes knowledge possible. So the same, I don't want to call it a thing, the same condition of possibility, which affords us the potential for knowledge, is what is making things manifest in the first place. Nothing would appear but for this condition of possibility. And then he says, the last line, although the good is not being, but superior to it, what it is that's a condition for the possibility of knowledge, and which also is allowing things to manifest as what they are, that is not being. Okay. So later in Heidegger, there's this notion, das Sein, existence. And Heidegger makes this important point. And Heidegger's thought comes from a very close engagement with the Greeks. And they say Heidegger used to be able to think in Greek, not just write in Greek. And he says that there's an ontological difference between being and beings. In other words, any particular entity, whether it's a thing or a person, is a being, small b. And there's a difference between those beings and being, existence. But then there's also something which is what Heidegger calls abgründig, abyssal, unfathomable. I think the Gnostics in Greek called it bythos. And that's what Plato's talking about.
Buthos. But
Buthos.
You said it in modern Greek. That was good modern Greek.
Yeah, buthos is what Plato's talking about here. Although the good is not being. No, it's buthos. So there is, it's hard to even put this in words. I mean, it's ineffable what he's saying. There is this condition for the possibility of knowledge, which is unfathomable, but it is that wellspring forth from which anything manifests in the first place, and one should not reify it or objectivize it as if it is being, capital B, okay? Or some kind of objectively existent thing. So that's what's going on there.
Wow, that explains a lot. So then Glaucon is like disturbed or something by this, by Apollo. And it's interesting he uses Apollo here, but instead of by Zeus, because there's some solar imagery happening here. What a daimonic superiority. Like, what? He's like, it's your own fault. You forced me to tell you my opinion about it, and I don't want you to stop either. So continue to explain its similarity to the sun. If you've admitted anything, and then he says, I'm certainly admitting a lot. Well, not even the smallest thing. I think I'll have to admit a fair bit, but, and that's interesting. He's omitting things here. What? So there's some things that he can't even say. But as far as is possible at the moment, I won't admit anything voluntarily. Don't. Understand then that, as we said, there are these two things, one sovereign of the intelligible kind in place, the other of the visible. I don't say of heaven or Uranus, so as not to seem to you to be playing the sophist with the name. In any case, you have two kinds of thing, visible and intelligible. Right. Now, this is where I actually highlighted this because this is clearly some Pythagorean esoteric shit here. It's like a line divided into two unequal sections. Then divide each section, namely that of the visible and of the intelligible, in the same ratio as the line. That's the golden ratio. That's the beautiful. That's what you see all throughout nature. The golden mean, the golden ratio. He literally just described it. In terms now of relative clarity and opacity, one subsection of the visible consists of images, and then the editors put together this chart. You can see the golden mean over here, and it's got imagination, akasia, belief, pistis, thought, dianoia, and then understanding is the highest level of episteme. And you talked about this in your book. This is why I brought this up. Because, so just let me get your thoughts on this and anything you see here that you want to point out.
Okay. I'm going to lay out my interpretation of this, which, again, in this book, like I go into this in some detail, okay? And it's a very subtle argument, so it's really worth reading it in the book. But to summarize it here, let's try to unpack this, and you draw me out on the finer points.
And one real quick, it almost looks like an archaic or ancient version of some sort of scientific way of thinking, because in the scientific method, and Bacon cites Aristotle for the scientific method, you first you have observation, and then you have then you have a hypothesis. And just to pull this back up, think about this: imagination, that could be observation; belief, that could be some sort of hypothesis; and now the thought thing, it's like you could almost think of thoughts as like doing experiments on it, thinking about it, doing things about it. And then understanding is when you come to a conclusion. It's almost like a proto-scientific method here, but it's metaphysical. So I just this is just mind-blowing to even talk about this. Anyways.
So I'm going to cross-correlate it with what he says in a number of different dialogues. At the most superficial level, on the surface, here's what Plato's saying. That in ordinary everyday life, we have beliefs about objects. So we see things through our senses, and we form beliefs about objects without all that much study or analysis, right? Now, when we're dreaming or we're daydreaming and engaging in imaginative flights of fancy about, unicorns and Pegasuses and whatever, things that don't exist as objects that are readily perceivable by us, that's imagination. So, on the most superficial level, Plato is saying imagination is inferior to belief because it's even more removed from reality. The things that we have beliefs about that are based on our immediate perception are more real than things that we fantasize about or that we create as conglomerations of different perceivable things and that we engage in flights of fanciful imagination about. And it's on this basis that in Republic, for example, Plato says that representational art should be banned because it encourages too much imagination and fanciful, basically hallucinations and so on and so forth. So he thinks that, overly mythological, fanciful expressions of art should be constrained in society so that people don't get lost in delusions and so that they can stay closer to reality. Now, our beliefs about readily perceivable things are inferior to an intellectual grasp of the abstract principles which shape the things that are perceivable to us. So that, again, going back to the text that you cited, Plato has a notion that the material substrate of the world, which is generally in a state of flux, in a dynamic and indiscernible state, like energy, right? What we would think of as energy in physics, that the material substrate of the world is shaped into the things we perceived by abstract forms that are not in the physical world. And these abstract forms have a causal effect on things. In other words, there's a formal cause at work in the world in addition to efficient causality. And being able to understand the way in which these non-material abstract forms shape the material substrate into the things that we perceive is a higher form of cognitive functioning than mere belief. So thinking, right, is higher than mere belief because you're engaging with the forms that shape the perceivable objects in the world. But there's a higher level of understanding than that. And what noesis is to be able to, I was going to say grasp, but grasp for certain reasons is not the right descriptor. Noesis, or this higher understanding, is to be able to intuit or have an intellection regarding what it is that makes the forms possible in the first place. Remember how in that passage before he says by Apollo, he says there's a condition for the possibility of knowledge at all. And the analogy is to the sun. So that, for example, in the allegory of the cave, within the cave, you have only the light of the fire that's up above the people chained to the cave wall. And there are these puppeteers who are holding mock-ups in front of the fire, and the outlines of these mock-ups are being cast onto the cave wall, and those shadows are believed to be a reality by the people who are shackled within the cave. So that's the realm of belief, right? Remember, belief and imagination, down here toward the bottom. If you escape the cave and take the tunnel up to the surface world, you see that no, the true source of illumination is the sun, okay? And so the things in the surface world, by analogy, are the objects of thought understood as shaped by the forms, but the thing that makes them light up is the sun. And to have an intellection regarding that, to intuit that sun mentally, is to have real understanding or noesis. All of this is on the superficial level. Right? This is what they teach canonically as Plato. And like you said, this schema is coming to an extent, I think, from the Pythagorean order, which Plato was a member of. Here's where it gets esoteric. And I get into this in Fundamental Thinkers. Plato, on the one hand, is saying that, the poets should be censored, that people shouldn't be, they shouldn't have their imagination indulged by artwork that allows them to go on flights of fancy and so forth. On the other hand, his entire philosophical project is framed in terms of a dramatic dialogue that includes tremendous amounts of Dionysian imagery, particularly in dialogues like Symposium, and where Socrates himself is described as a kind of Silenus figure, like a
satyr.
Yeah, a satyr with these flute girls and maenads all like dancing around him.
Dionysian.
There's tremendous amount of Dionysian imagery in the Platonic dialogues, and Socrates himself, at one point, I believe it's in Symposium, he says through the mouth of Alcibiades, Plato says through the mouth of Alcibiades, Socrates is like a satyr who, when you open him up, he's like grotesque Dionysian figure from the outside. You open him up and he's got all these statues of the gods inside him. And these are like the forms. And there's repeated references also in the dialogue Alcibiades to Socrates' teaching being like a serpent's bite, and that his teaching is venomous in some way.
The sting of the gadfly.
He's a pharmacus, a witch doctor, dealing in pharmacons made from snake poison. And it's all very Dionysian imagery. And so then you have to look more carefully at, Plato's letters, like the second letter and the seventh letter. And you see him talk about how anyone who says that they've learned his true teaching simply from his writings doesn't know the actual philosophy of Plato, and that contemplation of the forms is really just a pedagogical tool which is meant to put the mind in a state of tension where it's capable of accomplishing what is ultimately an irrational intuition of something that is not rationally graspable. And that this is truly the good as the beautiful. This is truly the good as the beautiful, which he talks about in Phaedrus as well, and which can only be comprehended erotically, which is why Plato says in Symposium that Eros is the only thing Socrates, through the mouth of Socrates, Eros is the only thing he's ever really understood. The only thing he's ever really understood. So when you excavate what we just went through on the surface layer, using these various other admissions and confessions, you see that even the sun is an illusion. And that's why he says by Apollo in the line before that, because as the contemporary devotees of the shining Apollo don't understand, the Apollonian is an illusion. It is a beautiful, shimmering, mesmerizing surface of glittering light beneath which is this unfathomable, dark, Dionysian abyss. Okay?
That's why he said, what a daimonic superiority.
Yes. And so that's what's really going on here. It has a surface exoteric reading and a more profound esoteric reading.
What's so fascinating about this, and let me just share this one more time just to highlight something. You mentioned Plato's cave is to get out of this bottom area of belief and imagination, right? Now, what's so what blows my mind about this is in Christianity, the end game is pistis. You're saved after pistis, you're done. They don't want you to have noesis. They want you to have pistis, and that's the end game. They want you in the cave.
Look, Christianity and every other revealed religion, including, of course, Islam, going back to Moses, quote unquote, is the con job being played on the people shackled in the cave by those guys who are standing on the plank. Remember in Plato's allegory of the cave and Republic, he describes how there's a plank or a platform behind the people who are shackled to the cave wall. And these archons is what they are. These archons are standing there, and the people in the cave don't even see them. And these archons are holding up props in front of the fire in a way where the shadows of the props are cast onto the cave wall. And this shadow play is mistaken for reality by these people with their baseless beliefs. And that's what Christianity is. That's what, beginning with Judaism, going all the way through Islam, these religious revelations are a shadow play that is purposefully deluding people. And it's being promulgated by archons who Plato understood very well, are manipulative governors in this world. And I think that even Plato's critique of Homer and of the conventional Greek religion is motivated by his understanding that it was promulgated by effectively archons who want to keep humanity ignorant and enslaved.
And so this is really what the Gnostics, they were looking at through scripture, and they were saying, this whole thing is exactly the opposite, actually. Yahweh is some demonic figure. He's not the one. He's not the good. And this is how you sort of get the sort of Gnostic worldview. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yes, but the problem is, first of all, I mean, that's 100% where it comes from. Okay. By the way, with a lot of Persian influence, but there was also a lot of Persian influence on Plato.
Yeah, he in the play Alcibiades, he literally says, "Oh, by the way, our whole tradition goes back to Zoroaster. He's the first. He's the beginning of it all."
Yes. And okay, let's just briefly, I mean, we've discussed this in other conversations we've had. People could go watch those videos, but briefly, the two major influences on Plato were Pythagoras, because he was a member of the Pythagorean order. I'm talking about after the death of Socrates. The two major influences on him were Pythagoras, because he was a member of the Pythagorean order, and then Heraclitus. And Aristotle tells us that Plato was a Heraclitean in his youth. And both Pythagoras and Heraclitus are completely connected to Iran. Pythagoras spent a dozen years studying with the Magi in the capital of the Persian Empire. And then Heraclitus was invited by Darius the Great to come be the court philosopher of the Persian Empire. Okay, so the two major influences on Plato are already deeply Persian. And then at Plato's funeral, the Magi attended. They came to attend his funeral. And at his funeral, they gave a eulogy saying that Plato was a member of the Magian order, that he was considered a Magi himself. So there you have that. But point being, yes, together with a lot of Persian influence, clearly this matrix of Platonic thought is what Gnosticism is born from out of. However, there is a certain metaphysical dualism, or let's say at least a dualistic tendency that devolves from out of Plato into Gnosticism, which you don't see in every Gnostic school, but in a lot of them you do, where there's this categorical distinction between, or let's say dichotomy between the material world and the spiritual world. And where the material world is considered fallen, and those archons in the cave are like basically manufacturing the material world on behalf of the demiurge, or the demiurge from Timaeus is using these archons to manufacture the world, and that they're controlling the world for the demiurge. And then there's a higher spiritual realm that you can intellectually ascend to by escaping this lower fallen realm.
And they call it the noetic realm too.
Yes. And that dualism is not in Plato. So Plato is not a metaphysical dualist who is giving a moral valuation to the intellectual realm as opposed to some morally inferior, corrupt material realm. Plato is valuing knowledge and informed judgments and enlightenment over ignorance and baseless belief and reckless decision making. That's not the same thing as an endorsement of dualism on a metaphysical level. That having been said, there were also Gnostics like the Valentinians who were not dualists and who had a more kind of emanationist view of the world.
Yeah, and where you do find that that dualist worldview is in the Orphics, who were like the original evangelists. There's a story about Antisthenes where it literally says, and the group of Orphikoi, came to him with a bunch of books that were written by Musaeus and Orpheus, is what it says. And they asked Antisthenes, will you be initiated? We'll initiate you right here. And he said, if I got initiated, will I go to the Isle of the Blessed when I die? They're like, yes, of course. That's the whole point. And he says, and you're initiated? He's like, yeah, of course we're initiated. So you're going to the Isle of the Blessed. Yeah, we're going there. We want you to come with us. Well, why don't you just kill yourself and go there? It's one of the funniest stories from antiquity. But yeah, that's that sort of thinking, but it makes you turn into that type of person where you're going around evangelizing to save people. It's the realm of pistis.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of Orphism, one of the great cinematic works of the mid 20th century that has a lot to do with Orphism that people should check out if they're interested in that is the surrealist Jean Cocteau's film Orpheus from 1950. It's a French film by the surrealist Jean Cocteau called Orpheus. And it's a very cool modern take on Orphic mysticism.
Yeah. Real quick before we move on, In the Orphic mythology, their central myth was the sort of dying and rising motif of Dionysus, where because he's ripped apart by the Titans, Zeus goes crazy and causes a deluge that doesn't just end the world, it ends the whole cosmos. And then after he takes the bodies of these dead Titans who consume Zagreus, who's a fruit god, by the way. Let's keep that in mind. They consume the fruit god, the forbidden fruit, and he takes their bodies because they consume this fruit, or the body of Zagreus, and he creates the new cosmos out of it. So now you had this, and the result of this is dualism. Everything is mind and body. The mind is Dionysus. That's the soul that's within the body. And the body is the flesh of the Titans. So all human beings, all animals, all life, all matter, for that matter, is half Dionysus, half Titan. And the good, you want to be in tune with your Dionysian mind, your spirit, your psyche, and you want to exit your evil titanic nature. That's Orphism. That's Orphism 101 for you.
Yeah, and it casts a long shadow over spiritual history because you still see the same
thing,
way of conceiving things in Manichaeism, all the way down to 400 AD, 300, 400 AD. Mani was in the 200s, but the religion thrived in that era, 400 AD. You still see basically the same belief at the bottom of it.
Yeah, it's the sort of sin, eternal sin, trying to get rid of sin, that type of thing.
Plato's conception of the philosopher ruler. Another very relevant contemporary way of conceiving of the role of the philosopher is in terms of social engineering. Nobody before the era of Plato, with the exception of Pythagoras, who's coming in immediately, generation or two before him, and sort of proto-philosophical figure. But basically, beginning with Plato, you have this idea that human societies should be, to some extent, deconstructively analyzed, pulled apart intellectually, and then deliberately reconstructed from their foundation by people who have a proper understanding. This is an incredibly radical idea. It remains radical and incendiary to this day.
People would call that fascism today because they're aristocrats in control. That's what they would say. I've actually heard a person I know, Richard Carrier, he's a Ph.D. in the history of philosophy. He's not a philosopher, but that's what his dissertation was on. And he calls Plato a fascist because of this reason. What are your thoughts on that?
It's more undemocratic than fascism. Let me explain why. So fascism is still a form of populism, where a Mussolini or a Hitler has to deal with the common beliefs and uneducated attitudes and customs of the majority of the Italian people or the German folk or whatever. And to the extent that there are some high-level intellectual advisors crafting policies for those regimes, those think tank advisors or high-level planners have to compromise to a great degree with the folk beliefs of the people, which is why, for example, Mussolini made a deal with the Vatican, right? Because the majority of people in Italy are Catholic, and, at a certain point, you've got to appease the folk. Well, that's fascism. It's still very democratic. It's a kind of form of conservative democracy. And by the way, most democracies, beginning with the Athenian democracy of Solon, were conservative. Democracies were generally based on what Rousseau calls a civic religion. In other words, a belief system that was customary and that most of the citizenry adhered to as an implicit, unquestioned basis for decision-making, right? So when you're a democratic assembly and you have to have a vote among the members of the assembly to decide policies, you cannot stop and question every presupposition that is in the background of one or another proposed policy. You have to assume that the majority of the gentlemen, and women were excluded from this in those days, the majority of the gentlemen who are members of the assembly were raised to believe in the same religion as you. So there's a customary belief system that's a tacit underbelly of, decision making in any democracy, and democracies don't work without that. So actually, contrary to what a lot of liberals would like to believe, most democracies are fascistic, and democracy only works if it tends toward fascism. And fascist states are still very democratic.
Yeah, and that's why even today in the U.S. Senate or wherever you go, you're going to see the symbols of the fascists. It's literally the idea of what fascism was supposed to be, at least, was the bundling together of ideas that don't necessarily go along with each other. So it's not Plato then, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yes. So let me explain. So people look at various Platonic policies, like the institutionalization of eugenics. Plato was the first person to propose eugenics. In other words, he took the idea of hybridizing and improving plants and interbreeding choice horses to produce the best race horses and so forth. And he decided we should apply this to the human population. And that's the beginning of eugenics, as far as we can see in recorded human history. Okay, Plato's the father of eugenics. People look at that and they think, oh, look how fascistic this is. No. Do you think the majority of people in the society of that time, any more than the majority of people in society of this time, wanted to be told who they get to marry and who they get to have children with, or who they're prohibited from falling in love with and having children with? Absolutely not. I mean, this is a completely undemocratic policy, okay? What's much more undemocratic even than that is Plato's idea that the philosophers ought to reorganize and really remake the religion of the people from the ground up. That in the case of Plato, the Homeric and Hesiotic religion is so corrupting to the ethical fiber of children, right? Like the Bible, it's so full of unethical crap, sadistic, backwards, just retarded, tyrannical behavior, which is the worst model for the development of an ethical person from childhood upwards, right?
I mean, look at Zeus. He's kind of right about Zeus and Ganymede. That's
100%.
Weird, dude. Yeah.
Zeus is a tyrannical, serial rapist and manipulator, sadistic manipulator of people, just like Yahweh in the Bible, right? Yep. And so Plato's looking at this and saying, we have to reconstruct the religion of the people from the ground up, and we need to make a belief. Look, they're not going to all become philosophers. In fact, almost no one's going to become a philosopher. So you can't cultivate noesis on the part of the majority of the population. You can give them an excellent education system, which he emphasizes, triple underline in Republic, how important the education system is. And he makes it a universal education system. Everyone has to, attend the same school system, and it's a meritocratic educational system. In other words, if you're a farmer's son or whether you're coming from a family of a statesman, it doesn't make a difference in terms of how you're treated and evaluated in the education system, to the extent that if you're a farmer's kid or a merchant's kid, and you prove that you have the capacity for noesis, you're taken away from your family and you're reassigned to be brought up by the leaders of the state or the scientific planners of the society, and vice versa. If you're a kid from the ruling class and you wind up, showing that you're not just ignorant, but you're retarded, you're taken away from your parents and you're put in like a peasant's family. Yep. Okay. And so there is a universal and meritocratic educational system. That's incredibly important. But that is not going to make a philosopher out of everybody. You're not going to cultivate noesis, across the population. So you have to give the majority of people a religion to believe in, which might not necessarily be true. It's what he calls a noble lie, or it's made up, it's woven out of noble lies, where myths and folklore are recast in various ways that will be more conducive to the development of the ethical fiber and ultimately work on the cognitive capacities of people to a greater extent than the garbage that they've been given to believe in by Homer and the tradition, okay? Or in our days, it would be the Bible or the Quran.
Yes, yeah.
So,
especially the Quran.
so this is why Plato is not a fascist. Islamic Democrats are fascists. So, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has democratic elections and they elect presidents, they elect members of parliament, but it's based on the civic religion of Islam in an unquestioned way. That is
It sounds
fascism,
like an oxymoron. Civic
it's
religion.
fascism, and it's democracy. It's a fascist democracy. Plato is not a fascist, okay? He is so radically anti-democratic.
He's aristocratic.
He cannot be, exactly. Don't mistake aristocracy with fascism.
Absolutely,
Plato is a true aristocrat.
Rule of the best.
Yeah. And that means the rule of the best. It certainly doesn't mean the rule of wealthy people. And
Nope.
one of the main proposals in Republic, which is insane, is that he says the ruling class aren't allowed to have private wealth. They can't have any property. They can't have bank accounts to prevent against corruption.
Yeah, you have to. This is not something that you want to give. People don't want this position. It's for the people who can do it.
No normal person would want this position. And by the same token, you can't have a concentration of force among normal people. In other words, you can't have, farmers and merchants and whatever building up huge armories where they can then lead a private army out to get rid of the philosopher rulers. Doesn't work that way. So weapons have to be sequestered within the ruling class and basically a caste of knights, Plato calls them auxiliary guardians, who are there to protect this system. So look, my point is this, that from the beginning of the history of philosophy, we have this idea, which then reemerges repeatedly throughout the trajectory of philosophical thought, that the philosopher can also be seen as a social engineer, and that we should aspire to engineer society, that actually the highest form of techne, and this is what Aristotle calls it. Aristotle says that the highest form of techne, the master craft, or the highest art, is politics. And in Nicomachean Ethics, he says that the properly governed state is the condition for the possibility of the cultivation of virtue and the pursuit of all the other arts and sciences. In other words, our capacity to know anything at all depends on people having set up a functional state for us. Because you're not going to have a proper educational system and proper scientific institutions that aren't interfered with, like, for example, when the mob in Sicily came and burned down the Pythagorean schools because they were teaching women and they were teaching ideas like reincarnation, okay? You're not going to have scientific research institutions that aren't interfered with unless you have a properly governed state. And more importantly, without the right kind of political system, you won't even have families that cultivate the right values in their children from basically their infancy onward. That the capacity to even become an ethical person is something that only arises in a functional family, and you cannot have functional families if you are living in a failed, war-torn state with, rival ghettos or whatever, and mass poverty and, constant insurrection, like these banana republics or like third and fourth world countries. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and this is very, again, the Christians have raped Aristotle. This is another way in which Aristotle is so anti-Christian, because he's saying to the Christian, right? Everyone can be saved by pistis. Just have faith in Jesus Christ and you can be saved. And even if you come from a horrible family and you come from the worst ghetto, war-torn, violent ghetto ever, and you've lived under the most abysmal condition and you've done horrible things, but you didn't know better.
You're the worst person ever.
Just give your heart to Christ, just confess and give your heart, and you're going to go to heaven, right?
And not only that, you have eternity with God.
Yes.
You are deified to the highest extent. You become higher than any other living soul or God or daimon that ever lived before you, just from pistis.
Yes. Whereas Aristotle says, in the most anti-Christian fashion, if you have been brought up without proper ethical exemplars, and you were in a family or in a community that did not allow you to be habituated from childhood in the right way, so that doing good things or performing beautiful, excellent actions eventually becomes second nature to you, you are fucked. At a certain point, if you haven't had either the right family or the right friends, if you haven't had a relative stability in terms of the community that you were raised in and that was supposed to inculcate certain values in you, you don't even have the condition for the possibility of becoming an ethical person anymore, let alone becoming an intellectual. You are so degraded at that point that your only worth is as a natural slave. And that's harsh.
That's harsh, but people listening to this might think this is harsh. We all know people like this who are they had a rough upbringing, they had bad parents, they were in the wrong neighborhoods, and they're in their 30s, and there's nothing this person will ever. He's gonna have to work construction. Hopefully he doesn't go to that jail. Hopefully he doesn't, that's it. It's true what he's saying.
Yep. And so social planning is important, okay? As much for Aristotle as for Plato. Aristotle has a more subtle conception of it because he's looking at the fact that Socrates was executed, the fact that the Pythagorean schools were burned down, and then that Plato went to Syracuse 3 times to try to turn Dionysius of Syracuse into a philosopher king and barely escaped with his life because the court of Syracuse conspired against him. Okay, they considered him a subversive with radical ideas, and he wants to turn this, Dionysius into some counter-traditional, thinker, and so on and so forth. And so Aristotle's looking at this and saying, I got to be more esoteric about this. And despite that, Aristotle also had to flee Athens and basically self-exile himself from Athens out of the concern that he would wind up becoming the next Socrates. He said, I don't want the Athenians to have the blood of another Socrates on their hands.
But Aristotle was more successful in cultivating something out of Alexander than Plato was with Dionysius. And by the way, I actually found out there's more of these sages from Athens getting sent out on missions to different kings and there's quite a bit of these stories like this.
Yes. And so Aristotle, he's talking about being sent out. That reminds me that also Aristotle had a think tank. He ran a think tank basically where he had laboratories where he would dissect the sea creatures. They would bring sea creatures from the Piraeus. He had to deal with the fishermen where weird shit would wash up in their nets that they weren't going to sell in the fish market. They would bring it to Aristotle's laboratories and he would dissect it and learn anatomy from them.
Galen cites Aristotle all the time.
But he also had think tanks that were writing the constitutions for various city-states on contract. So these people would come, sending people out is one thing, but he would have people come to him at his think tank in Athens, and they would secretly write constitutions for them. And the constitutions would be calibrated to the customs and the values of those particular people to use, Platonic noble lies, as it were, to develop a constitution that is close enough to what those people believe and what their customs are, that it will lead them toward the good in a way that they can still accept, that is going to be practical enough for them to adopt. And so this is social planning. It's social engineering. And
this even goes back to Pythagoras too. Because Herodotus talks about this Hyperborean king who came to learn under Pythagoras for a certain amount of years, and then goes back to Germany and then rules as a Pythagoras. So this was cultivating all throughout Europe, this whole plan. And this goes back to, this is a thing that's been happening for a long time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, we talked again about this in another conversation we had, that Pythagoras comes back to Samos and then eventually sets up in Sicily. He comes back to Magna Greca with these ideas after a dozen years in the capital of the Persian Empire with the Magi. So it seems like this social engineering business
good point.
was put into this Greek's head.
Well, should we be surprised though? Look at the Persian Empire. Look what it was doing. Look how it acted, how successful it was. This shouldn't surprise you at all. This is, Western civilization really does have its roots in the Persian Empire.
Yes, and the more important point is that it has its roots in people who based their political thought on Zarathustra, who is the most counter-traditional thinker that we had before his time. Okay? I mean, Zarathustra is literally inverting the religious worldview of mankind, where he's saying that these gods that you all believe in, they're a bunch of manipulative sadists. They're what the Gnostics later call archons. And they are serving a wicked principle, a negative principle, which he calls ahriman. And this principle of constraint and deception and manipulation is reflected in these gods and their rule over humanity. And you need to reject them. And instead, you need to worship wisdom and enlightenment. And you need to work on yourself and the world so that there will be progress. And bit by bit, the world can turn into a paradise. This is the ancient Persian worldview. And it's no coincidence that basically Pythagoras adopts this after a dozen years in the capital of Iran. And then, Plato belongs to the Pythagorean order, right? And the rest is history. So this idea of social engineering is radically counter-traditional and undercuts the customary religious orientation of mankind, whether it's a pagan religious orientation like the Olympian religion or Hinduism to this day, or whether it's a revealed religion like, Judeo-Christianity and Islam. In either case, what philosophy is doing from the foundation is challenging this in the name of human self-determination and wise social planning, okay, and the re-engineering of society. So this is what we see continued on in Auguste Comte, in Hegel to an extent, and definitely, again, in Nietzsche with his idea of the overmen and the masters of the earth. We see them adopt and adapt this idea in various ways throughout the history of philosophy.
That's fair. Now, anything less on what do you think about Aristotle? How much of Plato's project does he continue? And is he, because people like to talk about Aristotle and Plato as like they're completely different, and Aristotle rejected all this stuff in Plato. I don't see that as much. I think there's a lot more loyalty in my reading of Aristotle. What do you think?
Certainly the perennialist school that begins really in a way with Plotinus and includes the Neoplatonists, and then is picked up by people like Al-Farabi in Iran, in what corresponds to the European Middle Ages. And then you have these contemporary, relatively recent perennials like René Guénon and Avalon, so forth. Certainly those perennialists are wrong in thinking that Plato and Aristotle are saying exactly the same thing. I mean, there is this preposterous, they think, it's all the same. It's different expressions of the perennial wisdom and shit, whatever. No.
Platon used to say that too, and he's wrong. Yeah.
Right. He's a Platonist.
Yeah.
Neoplatonist. On the other hand, I agree with you that a lot of what Aristotle is presenting in the domain of ontology or epistemology, or his political thought that we just went through, is an adaptation of Plato. It's a building on refinement adaptation of Plato. Like, for example, Aristotle says, and also, it's not just an adaptation of Plato, it's that there are things that Plato is keeping esoteric that Aristotle makes public, that Aristotle, says more forthrightly. Like, for example, Aristotle says in the domain of ontology, there are no independently existent forms. It's not like there's a transcendental realm of forms somewhere beyond the physical world. And that from that transcendental realm, material things are being shaped into the objects of our perception. Rather, form is one causal factor intrinsic to the perception of any object, so that you cannot have a thing subsist. No thing can be a substance. By the way, most people don't think about this. Our word substance means substance. It's what makes something stand up. A substance is what is under the stance of a thing, what makes it hold up as a thing. That's a substance.
Yeah.
So Aristotle argues that no thing can have any substantiality unless it also has form in addition to matter. There's a formal cause at work in things in addition to matter. And where you can see this most vividly is in his description of plant life in, I believe it's De Anima, On the Soul. Again, these fucking Christians just read this and they try to read it into, their theology of the human soul and bullshit. That's not what's interesting about De Anima. What's interesting is where he talks about plants and non-human organisms, because what he says is that even plants have souls. Plants have a threptic soul that has to do with perception and growth. And he says that you can see that in plants, in their type of soul, there's a formal cause at work in addition to the material causality that has to do with what the seed is materially made of, right? And there's also a final causality that has to do with why it is that the plant absorbs sunlight and the ultimate shape that the plant is supposed to take as it reaches toward the sun that's nourishing it. That has to do with the plant's telos, or final causality. But there's a formal cause at work in the plant also that makes it the particular species of plant that it is versus another one. Now, modern mechanistic reductionist science rejected this.
Because of evolution, right?
Evolution is part of it, but when materialism predominated during the era of the Enlightenment, again, everything became efficient causality. And it's related to evolution in the sense that Darwin's evolution by natural selection is a purely efficient causal account. It's based on the selection of random mutations by the environment, which is all efficient causality. It's like billiard ball causality, bing, bang, boom, right? Blind, efficient causes. One thing bangs another thing bangs into another thing, things coagulate, they pull apart, all right? So in the early modern era, they got rid of any other causes but efficient causality again. Which, by the way, makes nonsense out of matter, by the way. And this was lost on Newton, this was lost on Descartes, this was lost on all these people, how if you think in terms of purely efficient causality, you can't really even explain what the fuck matter is. Whereas Aristotle and Plato before him were saying matter is a type of cause. There's a material cause, but then there's a formal cause that shapes the matter, that gives it the form that it has. And then there's a final cause that's what that thing is growing toward or developing toward, or what that, for the sake of which the thing develops as what it does, okay? But here's the thing, when Aristotle is talking about the souls of plants and the formal cause at work on, let's say, a plant as an organism, it turns out now we know that he was right. Because there are studies that have been done in the 1970s by Cleve Baxter, who was a polygraph expert who worked for the CIA, and hooked up polygraph machines to plants. And it turns out that plants are capable of communicating with other organisms, including people, and they also are
especially trees.
Yes, and they're clairvoyant. Plants are clairvoyant. They can see what's going on at a distance. Obviously, they don't have eyes. They don't even have a brain as we understand it. They don't have a central nervous system, but they have a form of perception. And Aristotle got this right. And there's a And moreover, as Rupert Sheldrake has shown with his experiments on organisms, both plants and eggs and, various types of flowers and, insect larvae also. Did a lot of experiments with insect larvae like fruit flies. Things have a formal cause that's at work on them that cannot be explained by the genetic code of the organism. So that during embryological development, whether it's a human embryo or whether it's a fruit fly that's developing, there is a form that's coming from somewhere which is not material and is not explainable by the genetics. And you can modify the form by, like, for example, bombarding fruit flies with radiation. It causes a kind of mutation in the fruit fly as the embryo is developing. And you will find that mutation in a control group of fruit flies that has not been subjected to the radiation. So you have a control group, and the more you bombard a certain group of fruit flies with the radiation, it warps the formal cause. And because the formal cause is non-physical and it's acting across distance instantaneously, a control batch of fruit flies that has not been subjected to the stimulus starts to exhibit the same mutation. Okay? Which shows you that there's an independent formal cause at work, which Sheldrake calls morphic resonance. Well, that's the formal cause, okay, that Aristotle was talking about.
So forms can change the realm of forms.
Aristotle didn't understand that. Aristotle understood that forms are at work on things, coming from out of Plato. And he said, look, these forms are not like people think Plato was saying they exist in some other realm, some transcendental realm. No, but they're an integral and intrinsic factor in the development of any organism in our world. And he was right about that much. What he didn't get was that even forms can change. You can mutate forms. And here's the worst example of that. Let me give you a crazy example of this. So let's say there's 7 billion humans on the face of the earth, 8 billion humans at this point, right, on the face of the earth. Let's say some horrible catastrophe happens, like the earth's crust slips or something, and there's tsunamis all over the world, and we're down to 1 billion. We go down to 1 billion. It's happened many times. Been many mass extinctions.
Yeah, the Dark Ages.
Yeah, I mean, even before that,
the Justinian plague wiped out 2/3 of the population.
Yeah, yeah. And then in medieval Europe, also the Black Plague wiped out almost half, 2/3 of the population. So let's say some horrible thing happens and there's only 1 billion people left on the surface of the earth. If a bunch of people went underground and there were large facilities underground where technology was sustained and you could carry on experiments in genetics, according to this morphic resonance theory, which Sheldrake has provided a tremendous amount of evidence for, drawing from many other scientists, if you start mutating humans underground, let's say you start using genetic engineering to mess with the formal development of the human organism, people on the surface will start to be born with the same mutation. So if you take a group of 2 billion humans under the surface of the earth and you start genetically modifying them so that their formal development is altered, people who have been completely untouched and are supposedly, engaged in a natural process of embryological development on the surface of the earth will start to exhibit the same mutation or deviation from the norm as the genetically modified population underneath the surface. You follow?
Yeah.
And this is a way of thinking that Aristotle would have understood. It would have been less shocking to him as it is to some of these materialist scientists, of our era.
They don't know what to think about. Well, it's because there's a presupposition, a naturalist presupposition, where they can't think outside of. They can't think of things as like, oh, there might be something great, something we're not seeing. They're like they can't think of things in that a priori way that you and I could, for example, as a philosopher.
Yes, and this goes back to the divided line of Plato that you laid out, because there are forms of understanding. There are types of understanding, not to use the word form, which has a technical meaning here, but there are types of understanding that involve, intuitions that are not perceivable, that involves the imperceptible, intuitions of things that are invisible, but that nonetheless have an effect on the world. Right. And that's what it means to be able to, cognize things, to be able to engage in gnosis, right, is to be engaged with a domain of causes that are not perceptible in a sensory way,
Yeah. One more thing on Plato. So Heisenberg was considered a modern Platonist. He's also like one of the founders of quantum physics, among other Germans. And he, the Heisenberg principle, that's his name on it and all that stuff. He said that when he discovered that the subatomic realm is full of atoms, that he didn't necessarily just think that the Epicureans were correct and Plato was wrong. You would think that would be his, it's over, Plato's wrong. Atoms and void is everything. He said, no, because actually when you disrupt the atoms and you smash two atoms together, they don't break down into smaller pieces. They form as they make symmetric forms. So actually, he said, Plato's right. Forms is that the bottom of everything is forms.
Of course. And not to mention that the important thing for Heisenberg is not just that the subatomic realm reveals form. It also validates the insight that consciousness is inextricable from the physical world, right? I mean, remember, for Plato...
This is why I'm not an atheist, by the way. All these things that we're talking about. This is like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for Plato, it's absurd for there to be any things without souls to perceive and understand them. I mean, the whole nature exists for the mind. Right? The mind is that for the sake of which things manifest such that we may know them. And what quantum physics shows you, and what Heisenberg explains in that great book of his, Physics and Philosophy, is that quantum physics is suddenly bringing us back to the way of thinking of the Greeks, where, from Heraclitus onward, nature is a flux that's in a reciprocal relationship with consciousness, with what Heraclitus called psyche. And psyche is co-constitutive of the physical world from out of dynamic chaos, okay? And that is basically the whole freaking idea of quantum superposition. So the cutting edge discoveries in quantum physics bring us right back to Heraclitus and Plato, and morphic resonance brings us back to Aristotle. Yeah,
and as you mentioned, the naturalist, the one who's presupposing just pure naturalism, when they see mutations, it's always just a random mutation that happened to work out for this population, and because of it, they evolved into this species, and now they're dominant. Now they dominant. But like you and I might think maybe it wasn't a random mutation. Maybe there's the forms working here, and people are going to watch this. These guys are crazy. I don't care. I'm just why are we presupposing all pure naturalism here when a lot of these things can be answered without it?
Absolutely. Let me give you an example. There is this argument. Now, look, the UFO disclosure thing is everywhere now. I mean, it's, the most hotly debated political subject. And there's this argument among scientists in the midst of this whole shit show, okay? From out of the circus, there are some interesting scientific voices who have been saying, it's rather peculiar that all of these entities that people have close encounters with are humanoid. For the most part, they're human. Even when something is described as a reptilian or as a mantid or whatever.
Yeah, because it still walks on 2 feet and has arms. It's still humanoid.
An evolutionary biologist who believes in Darwin would tell you that a reptile that evolved intelligence and was a tool-using entity wouldn't actually look like that. It wouldn't look like these reptilians or what, and it wouldn't. Let's say a mantis, an intelligent mantis would not look like the way these mantid people that people supposedly have close encounters with appear, right? Because they're operating from assumptions that are Darwinian, evolution by natural selection, so forth. What they don't consider is what, again, Sheldrake compiled really from out of a whole bunch of different biologists. You can look at his books, New Science of Life and Morphic Resonance, and also another book he wrote called The Presence of the Past, where basically he argues that it would stand to reason that humanity itself has a form, that humanity not has a form, but is corresponding to a form. And you can see this in again, mutations in embryological development, that mutations in embryological development are deviating from a form that is setting a norm on genetic development for the most part, except when there are contingent interfering causes that cause deviations from that in the form of mutations. And this form of humanity may predate the rise of Homo sapiens on the earth. So that if there have been things like humans on other planets throughout the universe, in other galaxies, in other solar systems, right? And let's say, these civilizations of humanoids have arisen and they've fallen, and maybe these species spread out and eventually they died out. But the fact that they existed for so many billions of years, I mean, we're a late species, Homo sapiens, on Earth in a universe that was already billions of years old. So maybe the form that we have, the basic form, 2 arms, 2 legs, upright, head, binocular vision, it's a form that was tried and tested and it worked out in many other worlds. And it's non-physically shaping genetic development on the earth.
Yeah, and we're not dependent on, like birds are dependent on air to fly. So it needs to be on a planet. It can't be in space. Right. Fish are dependent on water. Most animals are dependent on something sort of ecosystem, where humans we can literally adapt anywhere. We can conquer any sort of realm because of how we are. So it seems like we're the highest type of form of living.
So the particular resilience of the human form may have made it such that it predominates in resonating with biological matrices that could take that shape. And it is non-physically influencing, shaping organisms, not just on our planet, but across the universe, which is why whatever entities show up here kind of look like us.
Humanoid, yeah.
So that the Star Trek view of things may not be that far off, or the Star Wars view of things may not be that far off.
It kind of makes sense, actually, yeah.
There may be a morphic field that generally makes intelligent species look like us. Not saying that there wouldn't be some that look like octopuses, whatever, but it may be that ours is particularly effective. And
for this universe.
Yes, it's particularly effective, and it may predominate. So just as a hypothetical, I put that out there. Another way in which an Aristotelian Platonic manner of thinking may have been more or less accurate as compared to, let's say, Darwin.
Now, another person you mentioned, you said like modern science is bringing us back to the Greeks, such as Plato, Aristotle. You also mentioned Heraclitus. What about Heraclitus' thinking that is being vindicated today?
So, I mean, above all, it's what I said earlier in terms of quantum theory, the idea that there is an amorphous dynamic flux of energy, which is a substrate of the cosmos. And it's only in interaction with and interference with consciousness, namely what Heraclitus called psyche, that things take the conditioned and transient shapes that they do. Okay? That things aren't what they look like to us in an objective and intrinsic way. Things appear in the way that they do and change constantly and pass out of existence only in relation to our perception and experience of them. You see this in the fragments of Heraclitus. And this insight winds up being legitimated completely by quantum theory. And where it's actually more profound than Plato or Aristotle is that in Plato, and again, I don't think that Plato didn't get this. And I point this out in Fundamental Thinkers, that I think there are places where Plato makes a straw man out of Heraclitus on purpose, because he wants to develop a sophisticated epistemological framework that's going to wind up being further refined by Aristotle and becoming the bedrock for the sciences. He wants to develop complex scientific thinking, right? And so he makes a straw man out of Heraclitus, saying that, oh, Heraclitus, with his view that everything is in a state of flux, makes it impossible to know anything at all. No, not really. What Heraclitus understands, and what is legitimated by quantum theory, is that there are no objectively existent forms that would be there but for human consciousness. Form is something, logos is something, logical structure, articulated, articulated interconnectivity, the networked nature of things, the warp and weft of the world, which gives it any meaning, is something which emerges in the interaction between psyche and physis. Okay? And physis without psyche is just a chaotic flux of energy. It only takes the shapes that it does in our perception of things because we're there perceiving them. And our perception of things is in deep internal tension and conflict, depending on who we are, what our perspective is, and where we're situated in the world. So that people with differing beliefs, people from different cultures, people with differently conditioned perceptions and expectations see things differently. And this is really a war over how the world presents itself at a fundamental level.
Whoa.
So that there's a dynamic tension over how things are going to take shape in the world. There's war in Heraclitus on an ontological level. And this is borne out by quantum theory in a way that still people are uncomfortable accepting.
Because there's the idea that the double slit theory thing, where are you seeing, is it waves, is it particles? But then when you put a camera on it, all of a sudden it's different, or something something along those lines.
Yes, and you can carry out that kind of experiment of whether or not the quanta is observed on its way through the double slits or not, determining whether it manifests as a particle that's observed to have a particular location, or whether it winds up as an interference pattern on the other side of the double slits. You can carry out that experiment retroactively, where the whole apparatus is concealed and the measurement process is randomized and automated, and the decision is only made after the fact, so that the wave function is retro-causally being collapsed based on whether or not you make a decision in the future that you should observe the thing going through in the past or not. And if you extrapolate out from that, you could create whole systems that would be like what they call Schrodinger's cat, whole systems that would be in a state of quantum superposition, and that different people or different groups would be struggling with one another to collapse that superposition in one way or another. And that's like some spooky shit that Heraclitus would have understood well. Right. Where you're dealing with a war over the way the world is going to manifest at all.
And it shows the flux right there. It shows the
flux,
the underlying flux.
That flux has the nature of polemos in relation to conflicting psyches, which is why Heraclitus says war is father and king of all. All things come to pass, and all things come into being and come to pass in accordance with conflict, because the flux only takes the shape that it does in relation to consciousness, and difference and psyches are differentiated. They're individually differentiated, and they're differentiated among warring and rival communities. And so, now Heidegger eventually understands this in terms of a war between worlds over the earth, so that the hermeneutic circle, the domain of interpretation, on a tacit level, implicitly, the domain of interpretation that gives things the meanings that they have differs from culture to culture, society to society. And it's very hard for us to understand this because we live in such a globalized world with internet and, international television and, basically mediums of communication and connectivity that are increasingly collapsing the world of Shanghai, China, and, New York, America, right? So it's very hard for us to understand this now. But you would have to go back into the era where, let's say, European colonialists are entering the world of uncontacted tribes. And you would see, as certain anthropologists did in that time, in the era of, what's his name, who you were engaged with his work a lot. Fraser.
Oh.
Fraser, the anthropologist. Yeah. That back in those days, these European colonialists would come into the cultures of these uncontacted tribes, like, let's say, Amazonian shamans, and weird shit would happen. And they'd write about this. They'd be like, we saw some shit in the forest, like that, And the shamans were like, well, yeah, but that happens all the time. Like, those are just the tree spirits. And like, this is the thing they do. And like, and the Europeans like, what the fuck? What are these witch doctors we're with? And maybe the church fathers were right. Maybe we shouldn't have come here. Maybe this place is, possessed by Satan or something. And what you're seeing in that interaction is two different hermeneutical circles conflicting. There are certain implicit expectations of how the world should behave that the Amazonian shamans have, and there are other ones that are conditioned by modern European rationality, and they're coming into conflict here. And the really interesting and somewhat tragic thing that tends to happen is that if, let's say, the European colonialists overpower the native culture at a certain point, the hermeneutic circle of the Amazonians collapses. And as the tribal people put it, the magic goes away. The magic goes away. The world becomes disenchanted for them because their matrix of subconscious expectations has been sheared through by the rationalism of the imposing colonial culture. And they essentially lose the will to believe in the possibility of certain things, such that those things then become impossible for them. And this is the kind of thing that Heraclitus was getting at when he said that, there's a war over the nature of reality itself. And there's no objectively existent way that things are apart from the conflict and tension between various psyches in the cosmos.
Yeah, you're right. Fraser definitely gets into the whole homeopathic, sympathetic magic stuff about performing these rituals that sort of engage with Phusis nature. He doesn't use the word Phusis. I'm using that now. But this war, is there an Apollonian Dionysian thing going on, or do you think this is something different?
Yes. No, there's an Apollonian Dionysian thing going on also, because the Apollonian, as Nietzsche analyzes it in The Birth of Tragedy, is the higher organizing ideas, the crystalline formations of thought that, again, are like, shimmering, and they have a certain lucidity. They provide lucidity in their shimmering. They provide lucidity. They make you more lucid, and they offer enlightenment in that sense of being these brilliant crystalline structures that organize perception according to certain higher ideas, right? And depending on what those ideas are, now those ideas don't have to be, materialist. They can include like ESP and psychokinesis, understood in a rational way as part of a science of parapsychology, for example. They could. But depending on whatever those higher ideas are, a certain Apollonian order is being imposed on Dionysian chaos in a way that makes certain things visible and hides certain other things. And the things that get hidden or occulted are what we call the occult. I mean, that's what the occult is. The occult is the Dionysian that gets occulted by the Apollonian that organizes the realm of the possible for any society.
A perfect example of this in history is the late stage of the Roman religion in late antiquity, where you had this exoteric public religion of Sol Invictus, the sun. Everyone can see it. It's right there. It's not occulted. It's right there. You can see it. But then you had the Mithraic mysteries that was occulted only for certain people. You had to be initiated. You can't see it. In fact, it's in a cave somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that's a perfect example. You can see this in the church later on, where you had these little orders of Franciscan orders that are completely like, or like the up on Mount Athos somewhere. But then there's the worldly religion where everyone can go to mass.
Yes,
sort of like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anything else on Heraclitus? Heraclitus is one. Why do you open up with him? What was the reason for open? I got to go right to Heraclitus.
I'll answer that in 1 second. Let me just say another thing about what we were talking about, and then I'll answer the question about Heraclitus. Why open with him? What I want to say in response to your remarks on Roman religion is that, you see, Mithraism combined the Apollonian and the Dionysian. As you know, in the Hellenistic period, they start to use these references to Mithras as Apollo Mithras, okay, hyphenated. And you see it in particular in Anatolia, but it was fairly widespread, where Apollo and Mithras were understood to be the same being. At the same time, there's a tremendous Dionysian energy to Mithraism, and the Mithraic myth, has a kind of Dionysian substrate to it. A lot of Dionysian imagery and Dionysian structure to the various initiatic rituals.
The bowl being slayed. It's the Dionysian bowl.
Yes, and also Mithras sort of, originally Mithraism comes from a Gorgon cult. And this whole idea of Gorgons tearing the initiate apart and so forth is very Dionysian.
Yep.
And the whole intoxication in the Mithraic mysteries is a Dionysian intoxication, and also involves serpent venom, going back to, again, Medea and the Gorgons and so forth. So the Mithraic religion combined the Apollonian and Dionysian. It understood both light and shadow and the archetypal interplay between them.
This right here, this is a picture that was taken by who wrote the Mithraic mysteries. How's his name again?
You talking about Franz Cumont?
Franz Cumont, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you you knew right away. You can barely see it, but it says Dio Soli Invicto Mithrae. So Sol Invictus, Mithra is one godhead. Sol Invictus and Mithras, the god, the invincible god. Right here, it's hard to see, but it says Nama, which is it's archaic Indo-European word, doesn't even exist in Latin. Nama, like namaste. Nama Sabazio. Which is close to the Thracian, but it's not. It's something different. Some deep Indo-European language being used.
Yeah, Dionysus.
Give thanks to Sabazius, Dionysus, and he's the sacrificial bull. In the Orphic hymns, he's called the bull. He's called the bull-faced. All that, the son of the bull, all that stuff.
Yes.
So, anyways, I just wanted to make sure
exactly. And then again, there are other inscriptions literally where you see Apollo Mithras hyphenated as the same. Now, another cult or another deity, the reverence for which betrays a proper understanding of the interplay between the Apollonian and the Dionysian is Prometheus.
Yes.
And there's a reason why Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy, where he provides this whole analysis of the interplay between the Apollonian and Dionysian, says that Prometheus is the first mask of the Dionysian. Now, of course, literally Prometheus was the first mask of the Dionysian in the sense that the Prometheus trilogy of Aeschylus were the first plays that were ever performed. So literally, like, Prometheus is the first mask of the Dionysian art of tragedy. But
in fact, the city Dionysia, which happened in the winter or the early spring, I believe one of the Dionysia, I think it's the city Dionysia, or it doesn't matter. I'll put it on the screen. The one that happened in the springtime, which is weird because we have our Oscars in the springtime. What happened at the Dionysia was they gave awards to best tragedy, best comedy, best satire, and it was like an ancient Oscars. The first person to win best tragedy was Aeschylus.
Yep, and unfortunately, we only have one of the plays in the trilogy left,
and it's at the Dionysia that he wins it, where they offer sacrifices to Dionysus at that exact thing.
Yeah,
in fact, I was at Athens. At the theater in Athens, you know what's at the bottom of the theater? A temple of Dionysus.
Well, there you go. So the thing is, Prometheus is certainly a Dionysian figure in many aspects of his myth, not the least of which is, his punishment and his liver being torn out by the eagle of Zeus and so on and so forth, right? And the way in which Prometheus, let's say, how can we, the passion with which he sacrifices himself and just like throws himself headlong, heedlessly into a service for humanity that is going to wind up, leading to this horrific punishment, right? That is very Dionysian. And it's ecstatic. It's a kind of self-sacrifice that's ecstatic, which then, of course, is aped by Jesus Christ later.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's that. But then Prometheus is also super Apollonian. I mean, Prometheus is all about, like, he's the bringer of the arts and sciences, and all scientific and technical knowledge is being gifted to humanity by this deity who steals the fire of Hephaestus, and brings it and gifts it as a way to transfer the techne of the gods to humanity. So there's also this tremendously Apollonian aspect of Prometheus that, of course, includes his, forethought after which he's named, Promethea.
If you make a Venn diagram of Apollo and Dionysus, the middle, like I said, you have blue and red and purple in the middle. The purple section would be Prometheus
and Mithra. And it is no coincidence that if you really trace the myth of Prometheus, as I have repeatedly, including in my book Iranian Leviathan, you see that Prometheus and Mithra are originally the same figure. It comes from a Caucasus cult of a fire stealer who goes up against the gods on behalf of humanity, a figure that in old Iranian religion is called Amirani, and is associated with the Gorgons, which is why you see these references to Medea worshiping Prometheus.
Yeah.
Okay. And why Medea was also taken to be the founder of Mithraism. Medea
is also in Georgia or Colchis.
Exactly, which was northwestern Iran until 150 years ago. Okay. All of Caucasus was part of Iran.
And you have Herodotus and Diodorus saying the Medes were called Aryans.
Exactly.
And then they loved Medea so much, they changed the name to Medes.
Exactly. So this is the same figure originally. It's this rebel titan against the order of the gods, which on the one hand leads to the Prometheus idea in the West, and on the other hand leads to Zoroastrianism in Iran and the worship of basically titanic wisdom, Ahura Mazda, in the Iranian tradition. They're coming from the same fire-stealing titan figure associated with Gorgons and so forth. So, point being, the Apollonian and the Dionysian are two dimensions of a certain figure that you could conceive of as either Prometheus or Mithras. And this has been occulted. It's been occulted. Okay, so now, I can get to your question about Heraclitus, unless you want to say something else.
Well, that's the light bringer. That's so we know why it's occulted. It's the light. And
Yeah.
There's a good, and like I mentioned in my videos, talking, and I always slap Christians across the face with this. There's no Lucifer in the Bible. It's Satan is not Lucifer. Lucifer was applied to Satan for good reasons, and I admit this. Lightbringer. There is that one passage in Paul's letters where he says sometimes Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So there's good reasons why this stuff happened. And as you mentioned, this is the sort of synthesis of all what is opposite to Christianity, is this light-bringing deity.
Yeah. No, look, it's for very good reasons that identification was made. It's just that Christians are wrong when they say you can't have Lucifer without Christianity. Lucifer or Prometheus or the convergence of the Apollonian and the Dionysian or Mithras is way older. Yeah. It's way older. And it arose as a Satan, an opposition to the Olympian pantheon, or the ancient Indo-European pantheon. This is a Indo-European counter-tradition. That's what it is. It's a humanistic, progress-oriented, forward-thinking Indo-European counter-tradition. That's really what we're looking at. The Rebellarian path, which, in India was called the left-hand path. So the Ashuric path. In any case, Heraclitus, which is relevant to what we're saying, because Heraclitus, again, was invited to be the court philosopher of ancient Iran. And so he must have been deeply familiar with these beliefs and this form of mysticism. And when you look at the fragments, some people have argued that the fragments show Zoroastrian influence. And I'm sure that Heraclitus would have been familiar with the Gathas of Zarathustra. But what I see when I look at the fragments and think about them in an Iranian context, and I argued this in Iranian Leviathan, is Mithraism. What I see is Mithraism. And Artemis, Arta Amesha, as the original Iranian form of her name, Arta Amesha, or Artemis, was a Mithraic deity worshipped by the Sarmatians, known to the Greeks as the Amazons, an Iranian tribe, related closely to the Scythians. So when Heraclitus takes refuge in the temple of Artemis, I think it's another indication that the man's philosophical project is coming from out of a Mithraic substratum. Okay? Yeah. But why do I take Heraclitus first in this volume? Because Pythagoras was clearly a philosopher. In the epitomizing sense in which I lay out in the introduction to fundamental thinkers, the criteria that we talked about at the outset of our conversation of what constitutes an actual philosopher, all of them are clearly met by Pythagoras and exemplified by him. But we don't have any writings. We don't have any writing. So being responsible in a scholarly way, you can't take Pythagoras to be first and quote like Iamblichus says that Pythagoras believed that. Like, you can't do that. Okay. Yeah.
In the Pythagorean source book that was put together by Guthrie, it's mostly fragments from the Neoplatonists. And it's just like, and you can see it's got all the triads and the intelligible triads. And you're like, I don't know if Pythagoras, maybe he said something similar to this, but I don't know.
Exactly. So the first author that we have that fits the bill in all the different criteria that constitute a philosopher is Heraclitus. Okay. He has a proto-ontology, a proto-epistemology.
And he's pretty much contemporary with Pythagoras, right? He's pretty close. Yes. He writes about him, so he obviously knows who he is.
He was a little younger, I think, but their lives overlapped. Yeah. And so this is the thinker in the generation before Plato that fits all the criteria for a proper philosopher, and that's why I begin with him. But there's another reason. Aristotle tells us that Plato was a Heraclitean in his youth, before he developed the theory of forms. And so, therefore, Heraclitus' thinking is fundamental for Plato. And then you look further in the history of philosophy, and you see that Hegel is deeply indebted to Heraclitus for the basic structure of his entire thinking. In other words, the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic,
Dialectic.
Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as the motor for the development of history that puts all different domains of experience in a state of flux, so that, basic structures of scientific thinking are changing over the course of history according to this dialectic. Social structures are being transformed through revolutionary change over the course of history according to this dialectic. Styles of art are changing over the course of history according to this dialectic. All of the basic structural transformations in the different domains of human life are being transformed through a dialectical process, which Hegel is getting from Heraclitus. There's this deep impact of Heraclitus on Hegel's thinking. And I have to say also, the idea of the end of history in Hegel is something that he's getting both from Iranian thinking, because, Hegel was actually the founder of Iranology. The serious, complex, modern European study of Iran, known as Iranian studies or Iranology, really begins with Hegel, in particular his philosophy of history.
A lot of them start with Hegel. I mean, his two star students, on one hand you have Marx, on the other hand you have Bruno Bauer, who wrote on the Jewish question. He started the whole mythicism movement in Germany. He was a anti-Christian to the core, but also might have been a little bit influential on some of the Nazi thinking. Anyways, you have Nazism and communism coming out of Hegel in a way, which is
fascism, because Giovanni Gentile, the premier theoretician of fascism, was a Hegelian. Also.
Yes, the young Hegelians and the old Hegelians, and they clash. He designed this.
Right. Now this is interesting also. I'll come back to what I was saying in a minute, okay? But you see this with real philosophers all the time. You saw it with Plato, starting with Plato, that a real philosopher winds up with multiple schools that argue over the interpretation of that thinker. Okay? You have multiple Platonist schools that argue with each other over the proper interpretation of Plato. You have multiple schools of thought interpreting Aristotle that are clashing with each other. This is true of Hegel, like we just pointed out. And man, is it true of Nietzsche. I mean, you've got Nietzschean Nazis and you've got Nietzschean anarchists.
And leftists, leftist Nietzscheans.
Far radical leftist Nietzscheans. And, and then Heidegger was literally a card-carrying Nazi, a high-level Nazi party official. And then there are anarchist Heideggerians. And by the way, it's not an illegitimate interpretation. You can find a lot in Heidegger to support anarchism, actually. So what it shows you is that, and another example that's important is Auguste Comte, because Comte's thinking was actually implemented in the positivist regimes of Latin America, in particular Brazil, where it had a very direct real-world impact. And people argued over what the correct implementation of positivism is in, let's say, Brazil versus Mexico and other places. So the point is that one marker of a real philosopher is that his ideas are so deep and complex that people wind up having radically divergent interpretations of this person's project.
Right.
And that's how you know a philosopher, by contrast with an ideologue. This is not true of ideologues, okay? Like someone who develops a very narrow ideology, or let's say a cult leader who develops some kind of religious dogma, right? Like Scientology, right? There's one interpretation of Scientology, folks. And if you deviate from it, those fuckers are going to come after you, the Church of Scientology people.
Yeah.
Okay?
Look at this.
So you see what
you have these young Hegelians, they call it left Hegelians, Linksheglianer, I don't know how to say that, were a group of intellectuals in the 1830s from this guy, Hegel, and They laid out the groundwork for socialism and Marxism. Well, what the hell? And then you have these other guys this led to a split in Hegelian school between the conservative right Hegelians or old Hegelians who defended the compatibility of Hegel's philosophy with Orthodox Christianity and all that stuff, but also not even just, I think there's other right Hegelians who are anti-Christian, like Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer started off as a left Hegelian, later in his life switched over. Anyways.
Yes, and they both have legitimacy to them, because on the one hand, you can easily see how Hegel's account of the dialectical development of socioeconomic and political systems in a way that ultimately overcomes the alienation of the master-slave dialectic could be supposed to end in a classless and egalitarian society, such as communism. Hegel doesn't say that himself, but you can clearly see how someone would develop that from out of Hegel. On the other hand, if you look at, let's say, the philosophy of mind, Hegel is talking about the different spirit of various races and how different races have different spirits and how the state is best understood as an organism. And, that you need to understand a state as a social organism so that, different states are appropriate to different races, you see? And so, there's ideas in Hegel that will definitely go toward the right wing, and there's ideas in Hegel that are much more left wing. So anyway, there's that. Now, the point I was making is that you see this with all great philosophers, and it's one of the ways in which you can distinguish a philosopher from an ideologue or from the founder of a cult or religious
But you also
cult.
said this goes back to Heraclitus, Hegel's The Dialectic, which is pretty obvious, I think. I don't think that needs much explaining, but you can.
And so another reason that we already went through that. Another reason that I started with Heraclitus is because Hegel's indebted to him. Nietzsche is massively indebted to him. I mean, the whole, account of being or existence as becoming and the world as a will to power expressed in different forms of life that are engaged in perspectival struggle with one another on an ontological level is an ontology that, has taken shape under deep influence from Heraclitus, who Nietzsche considered to be his favorite philosopher. And Nietzsche both lectured on Heraclitus at length, and he wrote about Heraclitus at length. He has these two, the pre-Platonic philosophers by Nietzsche, is a lecture series of Nietzsche on the pre-Platonics. In that context, he calls them pre-Platonics. That was his preferred term because he considered Socrates one of the, what we call pre-Socratics. So he called them the pre-Platonics. And he had a whole lecture series on the pre-Platonics, which we have now in book form, where Heraclitus is predominant. And then he wrote this other little book, beautiful, short, but a gem of a book, the Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks.
Oh, yeah. I have a copy of that right here.
Yes. And in that book, it's clear that, Nietzsche is in love with Heraclitus, that, Heraclitus is clearly Nietzsche's favorite philosopher. Yeah.
Great book.
So Nietzsche is deeply indebted also to Heraclitus. And then, Heidegger, he does a whole lecture series. He does, I think, more than one lecture series on Heraclitus, which you can use as a key to decipher how much of Heidegger's thinking is indebted to Heraclitus. And one of the most interesting, go ahead.
I was going to say real quick, Nietzsche was even talks about how he's appreciates Heraclitus more than Parmenides for his reason of the becoming idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to get into this in great deal of detail, but, Nietzsche also makes a straw man out of Plato in certain ways. Just like Plato makes a straw man of Heraclitus, Nietzsche makes a straw man out of Plato in certain ways, and he kind of presents this narrative where Plato is being obtuse and not understanding the world the way Heraclitus did, and that Plato is taking thinking off in a rationalistic diversion that winds up creating this transcendental metaphysical arc through history, which Nietzsche sees it as his task to deconstruct. So really what Nietzsche is doing is bringing philosophy back to Heraclitus, right? By
he blames Plato for Christianity.
Yes, by deconstructing Platonism and Christianity, and where he's returning to his Heraclitus. And then we see the same idea in Heidegger, where Heidegger says that philosophy needs a second beginning, and that where philosophy kind of got lost in rational objectification and became increasingly dominated by a techno-scientific will to control things that endangers us with the instrumentalization of human life, where things went in that direction, which is not to say it's a mistake, but, because Heidegger, like Hegel, understands the development of consciousness dialectically. So it was a necessary diversion, but, as a kind of antithesis, there's a thesis that's going to be opposed to it that is going to sort of lead to a synthesis that represents a higher understanding. But Heidegger describes this as a second beginning of philosophy, or new beginning of philosophy, that would sort of pick up again where Heraclitus left off and take philosophy in a new direction with all of our modern scientific thinking, informing it, take philosophy in a new direction, again, from out of the understanding of the cosmos that Heraclitus had. And if you put, Heidegger's lectures on Heraclitus next to his own original philosophical works, you can see how much of Heidegger's thinking is also indebted to Heraclitus. One of the most interesting examples of this is in Heidegger's political project, which almost no scholars will talk about because he was a Nazi. Right? I mean, how many times do you hear about Heidegger's political philosophy? Well, he had one, but it led him to, become a high-level Nazi official. And this is actually one of the areas in which you see the deepest influence from Heraclitus. Heidegger stood on the same line to join the Nazi party on the same day, at the same hour, on the same line as Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was the leading legal theorist of Weimar Germany, political thinker.
No one went after Heidegger after 1945. He just kind of lived his life. It was good.
They banned him from teaching.
Well, obviously they're going to do that, but he didn't have to face any trial or anything, right?
He did. He was prosecuted and found guilty and banned from teaching as a punishment. Punishment. Yes, he was one of the prosecuted Nazis. And I know that. It's a long story. Tried to kill himself at one point. Long story.
Wow.
Anyway, so he's on the same line to join the party on the same day, same hours. Carl, he's like, "Hey, Carl, hey man, what the fuck you doing here? What are you doing here, Marty?" And they're going to join up with the Nazi party on the same day.
Wow.
Well, these two exchanged letters with each other because they were both high-level faculty members working on the reconstruction, as they called it, the reconstruction of the German university system under the Nazi regime. The two of them were working on it together. And they exchanged letters about it. And guess what comes up prominently in these letters? Heraclitus.
Of course.
And their shared interpretation of Heraclitus and the way in which they understood the aims of the National Socialist regime as being in accordance with Heraclitus's conception of sovereignty. Because the National Socialists believed in the persistence of a political sphere that's multipolar and involves differentiated and divergent centers of force engaged in dynamic struggle with one another. In other words, polemos. That the idea that the communists had, that you're going to resolve all social struggle and political conflict in a perfect universal society, right? Where the proletariat of the world will be united under a single political system, that is to dehumanize us by depriving us of the differentiating struggle that is the context in which our higher ideals become clear and that tests our mettle and forces us to define our character on an individual and social level. Okay? because you're going to wind up with one system, a totalitarian world state that conditions you from childhood to believe in the dogmas of Marxism, and why you're living in a society where social justice has been achieved for everybody. There's no outside there, you see? There's no outside where you can then judge your ideals and your society by whatever it is that rival societies stand for. Whether they're allied societies that are different from yours, or whether they're the societies of one or more enemies, okay? Now, that's a problem with communism. On the other hand, capitalism, which America was the exemplar of in that time, the Americans, and to a lesser extent, the British, the Anglo-American world, right? Capitalism threatens to dissolve all socio-political conflict through mercantile activity. Money becomes the common exchange rate for all things and ultimately dissolves all values so that everything and everyone has a price. And corporations ultimately become more powerful than the state. And instead of your communist world order, you wind up with a global oligarchy run by multinational corporations. And Heidegger and Schmidt were saying, look, this is also a misunderstanding of the proper form of political sovereignty, because it is also denying the ontological primacy of strife and the way in which, on a metaphysical level, political differentiation is a precondition for psychic development and for our cultivating a personal ethos. Capitalism is as corrupting to that as communism. And so they saw, Heidegger and Schmidt, in National Socialism, a third way that also was explicitly adopting and adapting the classical Greek heritage. I mean, you know, the Nazis were obsessed with the Greeks. So they saw in this National Socialism a third way to basically salvage or retrieve a Heraclitean conception of a political sphere shot through with strife, and where the differentiation between peoples can persist on a geopolitical level.
Sorry, finish your thought.
In a way that's conducive to the cultivation of personal ethos. Anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
The more you say this, the more it's getting clearer and clearer what you're saying, because I mean, look at the attitude, the warrior Homeric attitude of the Nazi Germans. I mean, they were going in and taking over nations, taking over North Africa, taking over Greece, taking over obviously France, and bombing Britain, and then you would think, okay, now we have all of Europe, literally, like we did. What we just did was like comparable to Caesar and Alexander the Great. Well, let's keep going. Let's go into freaking Russia. Like that can only come about from that.
Yeah, but here's the important point, Neil. Here, important place not to make a mistake is that it's not a will to world conquest that Heidegger and Schmidt found appealing in National Socialism, and that they found consonant with, let's say, a Heraclitean political philosophy. It's precisely the idea that the Nazi Germans were never going to take over Imperial Japan. The Nazis wanted the Japanese to be Japanese.
Yes.
Capitalists want Japanese to be American. And communists want everyone to be the Marxist proletariat.
But that's the Greek way too. Is every part of the Mediterranean had their own culture.
Yes.
And you don't stop their culture. You let them keep their culture.
Yes. And this is why Alexander's men betrayed him, and he wound up dead prematurely, because Alexander was a bad student of Aristotle, insofar as Alexander adopted Persian cosmopolitanism and wanted to create a one world order. his way of thinking wasn't, he left Greek thinking behind, and his men did not like that. So you see, this is what appealed to Heidegger and Schmidt, and it's why they had a common love of Heraclitus that you see, come across in their correspondences. So point being, that was all by way of answering to you, why did I start with Heraclitus? Because Plato is indebted to him, Hegel is indebted to him, Nietzsche and Heidegger's thinking are really inconceivable without Heraclitus as a background. And so he really winds up being the seminal thinker of the history of philosophy.
The only one we haven't touched on is Kant, and I know absolutely nothing about Kant.
Fuck Kant. To get into Kant now.
I don't even care because I've never got into Kant.
No, man, you don't need to get into Kant. No pun intended. You know how that word is pronounced in the original German, right? Kant is a mispronunciation, right?
What is it in German?
Cunt.
Cunt?
So don't get into Kant.
Let's not get into Kant. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's round it out with this. Nietzsche, obviously, is my favorite modern philosopher in the modern world. He's just, for so many reasons. I don't get much into modern philosophy. I've delved a little bit into Hegel. I mostly stay in the ancient world, but Nietzsche, I love Nietzsche. I'll read Nietzsche all day long. You mentioned he's indebted to Heraclitus. What else can you say about Nietzsche as far as what we've been talking about?
Okay, this is a great place to end. So, a careful reading of Nietzsche, in the context of some of these fundamental thinkers that we've already talked about, right? A lot of people read Nietzsche in their teens and they don't have any context, in terms of the history of philosophy and so on and so forth. And fortunately, by the time I read Nietzsche, I had already read a little bit of Plato. But often your first encounter with Nietzsche is ignorant of the history of philosophy.
So you don't know the Greeks, it's going to be gibberish.
Well, this is the thing. And this is how most people's encounter with Nietzsche, right? And so they come across thinking, man, it's all might makes right. And he's a relativist. There's no morality. And, the will to power, it's all about how if you dominate, then you're justified. And these supermen of the future, they're like these cynical, amoral people who can manipulate all of society and so on and so forth. No, this is not Nietzsche. Okay. And you can only really understand that if you come back to Nietzsche after having studied some of these other fundamental thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Hegel. And you realize that, wait a minute. The way in which Nietzsche is legitimately deconstructing Christianity is bringing us back to the way that Aristotle thought about ethics and how society should be run, right? And let's say Nietzsche's ontology, by deconstructing the Platonic Christian or scholastic Aristotelian trajectory of thought, which predominated in the Middle Ages, he's bringing us back to the way Heraclitus thought about ontology.
Yeah.
So Nietzsche is actually very much bringing us back into the sphere of thinking of the Greeks, both in terms of ontology and epistemology, and also in terms of ethics and politics. And one of the things that you realize in an informed reading of Nietzsche from out of the perspective of the Greeks is that Nietzsche's conception of the overmen is very much a successor to the philosopher rulers of Plato or the aristocrats of Aristotle. Okay, so there's a reason why Nietzsche also calls the overmen the aristocracy of the future. He uses that phrase on a number of occasions. He calls them the masters of the earth, the overmen, and the aristocracy of the future. He also refers to them as artist legislators or philosophical artist tyrants. And what he's essentially doing is further developing the Platonic Aristotelian conception of the social engineer, which we also see in Auguste Comte, he's further developing that in a way that's consonant with contemporary techno-scientific development. So that aware now of Darwin, right? Nietzsche writing in the wake of Darwin, deeply impacted by Darwinian evolution. Writing in the wake of Darwin and of the social Darwinist theorists that arose immediately together with Darwin, including, I believe, Darwin's cousin. Wasn't Francis Galton Darwin's cousin? I believe so.
Right?
Yeah. So he's writing Nietzsche in the wake of Darwinism and social Darwinism. And he's saying, included a bunch of eugenicists, obviously, like Francis Galton is reappropriating eugenics from out of Plato in the context of Darwinian evolutionary theory. And Nietzsche is saying, look, it's not just a question of a certain class of social planners reconstructing the society that everybody else is living in along lines that they have intuited and understood to be more conducive of human flourishing. It's also the case that humanity is an evolving organism, and that this current constitution of mankind should not be assumed to be the endpoint of our evolutionary trajectory, considering what's possible with emerging technologies and techniques. So that techne, as it's evolving in the modern era, and Nietzsche is bearing witness to, and techne broadly construed to include not just machines born of the Industrial Revolution, but also techniques in behavioral modification that are coming from out of psychology, and social reconstruction that's coming from out of sociology, a science that, after all, was founded by Auguste Comte, one of the fundamental thinkers I addressed in the volume. Nietzsche is looking at all of that and saying that techne is coming to a point where the basic parameters of the human condition can be altered by technology. And so it's no longer simply a question of a higher type of man being a social planner for the rest of human society. Things have come to where technology may yield a bifurcation of mankind into two divergent species. An overman, or superhuman species of the future, and a subhuman species which devolves from out of what Nietzsche calls the last men. And these last men are people, again, like to go back and remember what we were saying in terms of Aristotle, like if you have no proper upbringing and,
the last men.
Yeah, you're in a violent ghetto and so on and so forth. Well, things are coming to the point where, given the technological possibilities that are in play, if you're one of these, what Aristotle calls like irredeemably degenerate people, right? Nietzsche would call the last man, somebody with no aims, no direction, no ethos, no aesthetic cultivation, etc.
Which is most people today.
You're gonna wind up a robot. If you're in the world at all, technology and technique has progressed to the point where the machinery of production and control of behavior will turn you into a robot, into a cog in a vast machinery, which is going to serve the purposes of these highly differentiated supermen, the Ubermen, okay?
Yeah.
And they are going to meet the same conditions of the advancement of technology that we're witnessing today, cybernetics, virtual reality, mediation of everything by artificial intelligence, and the possibilities opened up by genetic engineering. They are going to meet all of those technological possibilities with vision, will, determination, purpose, inner cultivation, and they're going to use those possibilities to even further differentiate themselves from the undifferentiated mass of zombies that are going to be incorporated into the machinery of production. Okay, and we're going to therefore see a bifurcation of the human race. And this then changes what social engineering means from what it meant for Plato or Aristotle or even Auguste Comte. because we're no longer, and also it changes the dynamics of what Hegel analyzed as the master-slave dialectic. Because still for Hegel, the master ultimately needed the recognition of the slave on a psychological level in order to overcome alienation and be a whole person. In Hegel, the master's relationship to the slave needed to be restructured into a more egalitarian dynamic that allowed for the master to receive recognition from the slave as members of the same society. And this is one of the ways in which you can see very clearly how Marxist communism evolves from out of Hegel, because Marx thought communist society that's dismantled class differentiation is the only society in which who formerly was the master is going to be afforded that type of psychological recognition from the former slave now as his peer and fellow in society. Okay?
And the only way to rise above that class system is to have everyone believe that they're all equal and you're literally just, above it all.
Well, in terms of what? Communism?
Yes. Like a world communist system where everyone sort of has this, like, you're all just workers and you're all like, working.
Okay,
you have the masters of that. You have to be, there has to be someone controlling you.
Hold on a minute. This is a very subtle point, because now that's a critique of Marx, what you're saying right now. Because Marx believed that what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat was a temporary measure where these people like who eventually became like Lenin and Stalin and whatever, were going to take power. They're going to seize power and they're going to be very totalitarian, but it's just temporary. And the point is for everyone to wind up in an egalitarian society together where there's no master at all, right? No gods, no masters, right? But in point of fact, what actually happened was the leveling of the masses and a totalitarian elite, the Politburo, led by, the Lenins and the Stalins. And
with an insanely powerful military that can go and conquer most of Eastern Europe. Right.
Which kind of proves Nietzsche's point, okay, about the will to power. Yeah, and so what Nietzsche's saying is, fuck this egalitarian bullshit. What are you talking about? There's a minuscule minority of humanity that's going to be evolutionarily selected for. And this is always how evolution works. Exactly. Evolution picks minorities, mutants, that are optimized for certain environmental stresses. So let's say the environmental stress today is the fact we could nuke ourselves off the face of the earth. The environmental stress is how the fuck we're going to manage artificial intelligence, right? These are the environmental stresses. And a minority are going to be selected for their capacity to live in a way that can effectively manage these super dangerous technologies, including genetic engineering. And the vast majority are not up to it, not even close. In fact, their interaction with these technologies is going to be such that it fully transforms them into zombies, into robots, okay? And they will succumb to total dehumanization and instrumentalization for the lack of ethos and the will to differentiation and discernment, their lack of discernment. So what Nietzsche is saying is also a critique of the master-slave dialectic logic in Hegel, where the masters really aren't masters of anyone anymore. Because the slaves aren't really slaves. They're like literally robots. They've been cybernetically and genetically transformed into part of the machinery of production. And the masters have their own aims and purposes that are no longer dialectically dependent upon a human person that is being exploited or subjugated. And so you see, this is a very radical transformation that takes place in Nietzsche. And then Heidegger has a lot of anxiety about this in terms of the global inframing power of technological science and the danger that it will instrumentalize humanity, and deep weariness on Heidegger's part about the mentality of total control and what will happen if we lose our capacity to let go and to experience ecstasy and to have an openness toward being that's not thoroughly conditioned by a desire to control everything, right? Heidegger has all these anxieties about Nietzsche's will to power and what these Übermenschen are really going to be like, okay? Which are some of the reasons why in the later part of the Nazi era, like going into the 1940s, Heidegger increasingly distanced himself from the Nazis. When he started to see the aggressive eugenics programs and concentration camps and all this shit, he was like, whoa, man, this is some Frankenstein shit. I don't know if this is really the direction we should be going in with this. And he gives a whole series of lectures at that point in the 40s on Nietzsche and uses those lectures, Heidegger's Nietzsche lectures, they're like this, 4 volumes like this. He uses those lectures to implicitly critique National Socialism. If he did it explicitly, he'd have wound up being arrested. So he uses a critique of Nietzsche kind of as a straw man, to critique Nazism and the idea of the will to power. Anyway, so that kind of rounds out, social engineering, as it comes to Nietzsche and then Heidegger's anxieties about that. And this is reflected again in the later part of this book where the last 2 thinkers I deal with are Nietzsche and Heidegger.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm excited to finish the book. I'm going to go back to where I left off with Plato. I skipped ahead because I wanted to see what you were writing about Nietzsche and a little bit of Hegel. I said, I'm going to go back to get to Aristotle and continue on. But people really, the link is in the description. Get the book. Amazon, right?
Yeah, Amazon. Let me mention one other thing, which is that I just came out with a Substack called Metapolitical Metaphilosophy. And it's very relevant to this book. It takes the theme of the social engineer, which we've kind of been focusing on here in particular, and runs it through the whole trajectory of these fundamental thinkers that I cover in this book. So that essay on my Substack, which you can add also a link to my Substack in the description, is a good companion to this book. And I'm thinking probably to write a part 2 to that essay sometime soon, maybe by the time you have this episode out.
There you go. Check out the Substack, get the book. Also check out the other books too. Thanks for coming on. My audience always loves when you're here. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. I missed being on, and we should do this more often.
Yes, we will, and maybe we'll meet again in New York City. So,
all right, Neil. Thank you.
And you have just attained true gnosis.